Mm. The first memory I have of my stepfather is him standing in the kitchen doorway, looking at me the way you look at a bill you didn't expect in the mail. Not hatred, not even anger, just this flat, tired inconvenience. I was 6 years old, sitting at the breakfast table with a bowl of cereal, and he walked right past me to kiss my mother good morning like I was part of the furniture. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself that for the next 12 years. My name is Serena. My mother's name was Claire. The man who raised me, or rather, the man who lived in the same house as me while my mother raised me, was named Gerald. And for as long as I can remember, there was a wall between Gerald and me that nobody ever acknowledged out loud. Not my mother, not our neighbors, not the aunts and uncles who came over for holidays and marveled at what a lovely family we were. My mother had married Gerald when I was 4. She never told me much about the years before that, before Gerald. Before our house in Dayton, with the green shutters and the rose bushes she tended like they were her real children. What I knew was that she had been young and in love with someone before Gerald, someone whose name she never said in front of me. What I knew was that Gerald knew something about that, something that sat between them like a stone. Neither of them ever moved. He wasn't violent. I want to be clear about that, because people always ask. He never raised a hand to me. He never screamed. What he did was quieter and in some ways harder to explain to people who haven't lived it. He coached my half-brother Danny's little league team for 6 years straight. He drove Danny to every practice, every game, every tournament, 3 towns over, sometimes leaving at 6 in the morning on a Saturday. He built Danny a treehouse in the backyard the summer Danny turned 9. Spent 3 weekends on it. I remember watching from my bedroom window, the two of them up there with their hammers and their matching grins. That same summer I asked if I could take dance classes. My mother said she'd ask Gerald. She never brought it up again, and I learned not to ask twice. When I was 10, Gerald sat Danny down and told him he'd be paying for Danny's college education, every cent as long as Danny kept his grades up. He said it at the dinner table. He looked at Danny the whole time. I sat 2 feet away and he never once glanced in my direction. My mother looked at her plate. I did my homework alone. I paid for my own school supplies with babysitting money, starting at age 12. When my guidance counselor called my mother junior year to say I'd been nominated for a regional academic award, Gerald said huh and went back to watching television. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you this so you understand the arithmetic of that house. So you understand why, when everything finally broke open, I wasn't surprised. I had been doing that math in my head for years. My mother got sick when I was 15. It came on fast, the way those things sometimes do. A cough that didn't leave, a scan that showed something it shouldn't. Then suddenly we were in a different kind of life than the one we'd been living. She fought hard. For 2 years she fought, and during those 2 years something shifted in her. She started looking at me differently, softer, like she was seeing something she'd been avoiding. The August before my senior year, she called me into her room on a Sunday afternoon. Gerald had taken Danny to a football game. The house was quiet, the way it only ever got when they were both gone. She was propped up on pillows, thinner than she'd been even a month before, and she held out her hand for mine. She told me she needed to tell me something. She said she'd been trying to find the right time for years, and she understood now that she'd been a coward. She told me about a man named Thomas. They had met in their mid-20s, before Gerald, before Dayton, when my mother was living in Columbus and working at an architecture firm. Thomas had been a client. They had fallen in love the way she described as completely and stupidly, her words. And for almost 2 years they were together. Then his firm relocated him to Seattle. He asked her to come. She was scared. She stayed. She stayed. They ended things badly, not cruelly but badly, the way things end when 2 people who love each other are also afraid of each other. 4 months later, she found out she was pregnant. She sat with that knowledge alone for 3 weeks before she told Gerald, whom she'd been dating casually for about 6 months by then. She told me she wasn't proud of what she did next. She said she let Gerald believe the baby was his. She said she told herself it was possible, that the timing was close enough. that she was doing what was best for everyone. She said she had convinced herself of a lot of things she no longer believed. I sat very still while she talked. I had always known, the way you know things in your body before your mind catches up. That wall between Gerald and me had never been my imagination. He had known or suspected something from early on, she said, and when I was 3, he had pushed her hard enough that she admitted it. She had never told Thomas. Gerald had stayed, but something in him had never forgiven either of us. She pressed a piece of paper into my hand, Thomas's full name, the city she believed he still lived in. She said she had looked him up once, years ago, and he was still in the Pacific Northwest. She said she didn't know if he knew I existed. She thought probably not. She asked me to forgive her. I held her hand and told her I did. And I meant it, because she was my mother and she was dying and some things matter more than being right. She passed away 4 months later, in December, 2 weeks after my 17th birthday. Gerald cried at the funeral. Danny cried. I stood between them at the graveside and felt like a stranger at my own mother's funeral, which I suppose in some way I had always been a stranger in that house. After she died, things didn't get worse exactly, they got more honest. Gerald stopped performing the small courtesies he'd maintained while my mother was alive. The occasional, "How was school?" The birthday cards he signed his name to. He wasn't cruel. He was just absent in a way that was no longer deniable. I was a senior in high school, 17 years old, and I was largely running my own life out of the bedroom at the end of the hall. I found a job waitressing. I applied to colleges on my own, filled out the financial aid forms alone at the kitchen table, while Gerald and Danny watched TV in the next room. I got into a state school in Cincinnati on a partial scholarship. I found the rest in loans and work study. Gerald signed the forms he was legally required to sign. He didn't offer anything more. The night of my high school graduation, he took Danny out to dinner to celebrate Danny's finishing 8th grade. I don't think it was intentional. I think it genuinely did not occur to him. I ate a bowl of cereal alone in that kitchen and thought about my mother. I also thought about Thomas. I had kept that piece of paper she gave me. I'd folded it small and kept it in the back of a journal I'd had since middle school. I took it out sometimes, just to look at it. Thomas Reeves, she had written. Seattle Woshai. She'd written it in her careful architect's handwriting, each letter even and deliberate. Like, even this she'd wanted to do precisely. I didn't reach out to him then. I wasn't ready, and I was afraid he wouldn't respond, afraid he would, afraid of what it would mean either way. I packed my room into boxes that June, loaded them into the back of my friend Kayla's car, and drove to Cincinnati without looking back at that green shuttered house. College changed me the way it changes most first-generation students, who grew up largely invisible. It showed me what it felt like to be seen. I had professors who remembered my name, friends who called when I didn't show up. A roommate named Priya who sat with me through more late-night crises than I deserved. I found I was good at things. I found I was, in fact, a lot of things I hadn't had space to be before. I also found, junior year, that the ache for something I couldn't name wasn't going away. I was 21 when I looked Thomas Reeves up for the first time. It wasn't hard. He was an architect, like my mother had been. And he had his own firm in Portland by then. There was a photo on the firm's website. I sat in my dorm room on a Tuesday night and stared at it for a long time. He had dark eyes, the same shape as mine. His jawline was familiar in a way that had nothing to do with having ever met him. I didn't reach out. Not yet. I closed the laptop and went to bed and lay there staring at the ceiling for 2 hours. What stopped me wasn't fear exactly. It was this. I didn't want to upend his life based on what my dying mother had told me in a bedroom in Dayton. I wanted to know. But I wanted to know for certain. I ordered a DNA test that week. Sent it in, got my results, and spent an evening going through my matches with the focus I hadn't given anything since finals. His last name appeared in my close family matches within 2 months. A woman named Patricia Reeves, listed as a likely first cousin. There was no direct match to Thomas himself, because he hadn't tested, but I had enough. I sat with that for a long time. I graduated college at 22, moved to Columbus for work, built something that looked and felt like a real life. I kept the folder I'd made, Thomas's website, the DNA results, my mother's handwriting on that slip of paper. I added to it sometimes. I wasn't ready. And then I turned 25, and I got a phone call from Gerald's sister, my Aunt Roberta, who I'd always liked and who'd always been quietly kind to me in a way that suggested she saw more than she let on. Gerald was getting remarried. There was a party. He wanted family there. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment after Roberta told me, processing that word. Family. I thought about all the Little League Saturdays. I thought about the treehouse. I thought about my mother looking at her plate. I said I'd think about it and I hung up. I don't know exactly what shifted in me after that call. Maybe it was the word family, deployed so casually to describe an arrangement that had never once felt like one. Maybe it was that I was 25 and tired of carrying weight that wasn't mine. Whatever it was, I opened my laptop that same evening and found the contact form on Thomas Reeves Architecture's website. I stared at the blank message box for 40 minutes. Then I typed, "My name is Serena. My mother was Claire Hadley. I think you may have known her in Columbus in the late 1990s. I have some information I'd like to share with you, if you're open to it. I understand if you're not." I hit send before I could think too hard about it. He responded in 11 hours. He said he remembered my mother. He said her name was one he hadn't said out loud in years. He said he didn't know what I meant by information, but that he was open to a phone call if I was comfortable. We talked for 3 hours that first call. He hadn't known. That was the thing I most needed to hear. And it was the first thing he made clear once I told him everything. That he had never been told, had never been given the chance, had spent 25 years not knowing I existed. His voice on the phone was careful, and even while I talked. But when I finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. Then he said very quietly, "I would have wanted to know. I want you to know that." I cried then. I hadn't planned to. We talked every week after that, then twice a week. He wanted to meet in person and I wanted that too, but we were both cautious, both aware of how much weight was sitting on whatever we were building, and neither of us wanted to rush it into something fragile. He told me about his life, his firm, his daughter from a marriage that had ended amicably when she was small, his home in Portland with a garden that he admitted had gotten out of control during a particularly busy quarter. I told him about Columbus, about my job at a non-profit doing grant writing, about Priya who'd moved to Cleveland and still called every Sunday. I told him about Gerald. He listened to all of it without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I finished, he said, "You deserved better than that. I'm sorry I wasn't there to give it." I didn't know what to do with that much straightforward kindness. I sat with it for days afterward. Gerald's engagement party was in April, a Saturday afternoon at his house in Dayton. Roberta called to confirm I was coming. I said yes. I want to be honest about why I said yes. It wasn't to cause a scene. It wasn't revenge in any theatrical sense. It was something simpler and harder to explain. I had spent my entire childhood being invisible in that house, and I think some part of me needed to stand in it one more time as the person I had actually become. I needed to close something. I also called Thomas the week before the party. I told him where I was going and why. He listened. Then he said, "Do you want company?" I told him I thought I'd better go alone, that this was something I needed to do for myself first. He said he understood. He said he understood. He said he understood. He said, "Call me after." And I said I would. The house looked the same from the outside. Rose bushes, green shutters. Gerald's fiancée had added a new welcome mat. Inside it smelled the same. That particular combination of wood cleaner and something cooking. And for a moment, I was 6 years old in the kitchen doorway again. There were maybe 30 people there, neighbors, Gerald's colleagues, Danny and his girlfriend, Roberta, who hugged me long and hard and whispered, "I'm glad you came," into my shoulder. Gerald's fiancée, a pleasant woman named Donna, who shook my hand warmly and seemed to have no idea what to make of me, which wasn't her fault. Gerald looked at me the way he always had. That flat calculation, checking me against some ledger I'd never had access to. He said, "Serena," when I walked in, The way you say a weather event you've been expecting. Nothing more. I moved through the party like someone walking through a place they used to dream about. Polite, present, fine. I talked to Roberta. I was kind to Donna. I ate a sandwich and complimented Gerald's colleague on his garden and said all the right things. About an hour in, Gerald found me near the windows that looked out on the backyard. Danny's old treehouse was still there, weathered now, the wood gone gray. He stood next to me looking out at it and said without preamble, "I want us to be civil. Going forward. For Danny's sake. For the family." There was that word again. I turned and looked at him. He was older, of course, the gray more settled in now. And something in his face was different. Softer, or maybe just tired. The way people get when they stop holding something rigid. I said, "Gerald, I want to ask you something, and I'd like an honest answer." He looked at me with that old weariness. I said, "Did you love her?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said yes. "In my way," he said. "I loved her." "I know she hurt you," I said. "I know she hurt you," I said. "I know she kept things from you that she shouldn't have. I'm not here to argue about that." I paused. "But I was a child. And none of what happened between you and her was mine to carry." He opened his mouth and closed it. "I'm not angry," I told him. And it was true. Standing there in that house looking at that old tree house, I realized I had put the anger down somewhere along the way, without quite noticing. I have a father, his name is Thomas. He's in Portland. He's a good man who didn't know I existed for 25 years because of choices other people made. We're figuring it out. Gerald looked at me for a long time. Something moved across his face that I couldn't fully name. Not guilt, exactly. Something adjacent to it. "I didn't handle it well," he said finally, and it was so plain and unglamorous that I almost laughed. Not cruelly. Just with recognition. That was as close as Gerald would ever come, and we both knew it. "No," I said. "You didn't." I left the party 20 minutes later. Hugged Roberta at the door, told Donna congratulations, and meant it. I sat in my car in Gerald's driveway and called Thomas. He picked up on the second ring. I told him how it went, all of it, and he listened the way he always did. When I finished there was a warm quiet on the line. "How do you feel?" he asked. I thought about it. "Like I put something down," I said. "Something heavy." He said, "Good." We talked until I was out of the Dayton city limits, the flat Ohio landscape opening up on either side of the highway, the late afternoon light doing that thing it does in spring when it goes golden sideways and makes everything look like a photograph of itself. Thomas came to Columbus 6 weeks later. We met at a coffee shop near my apartment, and I got there early and sat at a corner table and watched the door. When he walked in, I recognized him immediately from the website photo, though he was taller than I'd expected. And when he saw me, his face did something unguarded and complete that I don't have quite the right words for. He sat down across from me. He looked at me for a moment, really looked, the way people do when they're searching for themselves in someone else's face. And then he smiled and said, "You have my eyes." "I know," I said. "I noticed that too." We talked for 4 hours. We closed the coffee shop. We stood outside on the sidewalk afterward in the May evening and talked for another hour. And at the end of it, he hugged me in the tentative, careful way of someone who is very much aware that they are not entitled to it and is doing it anyway because not doing it would be worse. I drove home that night and sat in my apartment in the quiet, thinking about all the things that are irreversible. The years, the distance, the choices my mother made, the choices Gerald made, the childhood that happened and cannot be unhappened, thinking about all the things that are, despite all of that, still available. I called Priya. She cried. Which made me cry. Which is how most of our phone calls go. The tree house in Gerald's backyard is probably still standing. I haven't been back to Dayton since the party, and I don't know if I will be. I think about my mother sometimes, about that August afternoon in her room. The careful handwriting on that slip of paper, the things she was trying to make right with the time she had left. I think she did the best she could do at the end, and I have made my peace with the best, not always being enough. Thomas and I talk every week now, sometimes more. His daughter, who is 17 and apparently very funny, sent me a meme last month with no context, and I consider this the most promising development so far. He's flying out to Columbus next month, and I am taking 3 days off work, and we are going to figure out the rest of this as we go. If you grew up invisible in your own home, I want you to hear this. The family you deserved and didn't get is not the end of the story. It is not even the most important part of the story. What you build after, with the people who choose you and whom you choose, that is the part that is yours. Gerald did not ruin me. He just made me someone who learned very early to build her own treehouse.